So the English name Algol is derived from the Arabic Ras al Ghul, translates to head of the ghoul. And the ghoul is a corpse-eating monster, but the term can also be used to describe a gluttonous or greedy person. Now, the name certainly corroborates the reputation Algol has maintained over thousands of years throughout the tradition. Algol can be found in the charts of numerous perpetrators and victims of violent crime. There are actually a handful of literal corpse eaters. Jeffrey Dahmer with Venus pretty close to Algol, and the Vampire of Hanover, Fritz Haarmann, with Mars and Pluto conjunct Algol. He was executed via decapitation. But to be fair, there are also a bunch of examples of cannibals who don't have anything on Algol. There are at least as many cannibals with planets close to the nearby Pleiades. A topic for another day, perhaps. But the examples are numerous enough to support that, yeah, Algol does that sometimes. But in practice, killers, criminals, cannibals, and their victims represent only a tiny fraction of those with planets conjunct Algol. More often, an Algol placement will signify different ways of relating to the topic. Ghouls, villains, and monsters, such as the DC Comics supervillain Ra's al Ghul. Ra's al Ghul first appeared in the 232nd issue of Batman in June of 1971, which, surprise, surprise, coincided with a conjunction between Saturn and Algol. Ra's al Ghul's illustrator, Neil Adams, was also born with Saturn and Uranus conjunct Algol. Ra's al Ghul is an international criminal mastermind whose ultimate goal is a world in perfect environmental balance. He believes that the best way to achieve this balance is to eliminate most of humanity. He tries to assault the world's human population with biological weapons and genetically engineered viruses. Renowned filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, born with Jupiter conjunct Algol, he has built a career out of his lifelong obsession with monsters. The elaborate, beautiful, and often terrifying monsters which he designs himself and brings to life in his films are not just to scare the audience. Del Toro sees monsters as powerful metaphors, a means by which he can explore more difficult topics in his films and engage the audience with the darkest parts of human nature.
So the monsters and fantasy and all that allows you to graduate towards the dark and say, look, can we identify with the monster, the other, the weird, the angry?
Algol resides within a constellation which depicts perhaps one of the most famous monster stories of all time. The constellation Perseus, which is a collection of 48 stars named after none other than the hero of Greek myth himself, Perseus, where he is immortalized holding the severed head of the Gorgon Medusa. And it is within the story of Medusa that we find much of the meaning associated with the fixed star Algol.
Myths are strange. As time goes by, as civilizations are born and die, as people grow and change, so do myths. And in many ways, you could say that these things that I just listed are the very blood that courses through the veins of myths. You can think of myths as creatures in a way. They're not like your cat or your dog. They don't have a body, but they're still very much out there doing things and interacting with people in this strange, bodiless way. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is because the myth that you're about to hear might be a little bit different from the way you're used to hearing about Medusa. But here's one of those times where myths begin to take new shape and look a little bit different than they used to. But still, they still have that essence that says this myth is this thing's myth, not some other myth. The story might be slightly different, the words being used are slightly changed, but that essence is still there. So, I think if you bear with me and you let me tell you the way that I heard the story of Medusa, I think you're going to learn something new about this creature. The story starts pretty much where every story starts, at the very beginning, before anything was even here. At a time before time, like really before anything, the goddess Athena had an idea, she had a thought, and she thought, essentially what she thought was, wouldn't it be so cool if there was this one soul that originally was destined to be born mortal, so it would still have a normal life like every person would, even though people were not a thing yet at that time. But at the soul's deathbed, it would explode and shatter into billions of tiny pieces that would spread across the whole entire universe. So what she wanted for the soul was that upon shattering, it would create a rock. It's transparent, solid, glistening, and has this sort of strength, but at the same time, it's beautiful, like a star shining in the night sky. And that stone eventually would be known to people as the diamond. The thing with that idea, though, is that Athena didn't really realize how burdensome that experience would actually be for the soul. But we're gonna get there. So the soul was, of course, Medusa. She was born on May 20th in the year 19 at 3:31 a.m. in Athens, Greece. And as she was born, she fulfilled Athena's prophecy, because really that idea that Athena had was, in a way, a prophecy that this would indeed come to happen once time started flowing. And Medusa was born from pretty special parents. She was born from two of the original primordial snakes that bore life to many of the creatures in the ocean. They weren't the ocean gods per se, but they were under the ocean god, which was Poseidon. These two snakes were known as Ceto and Phorcys. And like I said, they gave life to a whole lot of other ocean creatures. And even when Medusa was born, she was actually not the only offspring to come out of that batch of offspring. She actually had two sisters that came with her, and those were Stheno and Euryale, which looked very much like their parents, but Medusa was a little different. She looked pretty much just like a child, like a regular child, but she wasn't quite a baby when she came out of her egg. She probably looked at least 4 or 5 as she was coming out. But I don't think that was a very surprising thing for anybody involved, like her parents, Ceto and Phorcys. It was very evident from the start that that egg did not look like the others. Stheno and Euryale came out of these black eggs, just like any other god serpent egg out there. But Medusa came out of this egg that basically looked like a rock. The big difference is that it wasn't opaque like all the other rocks around the ocean. This one was transparent and shiny. And of course, you're probably already thinking, her egg was the first diamond. As Medusa drew her first breath, Athena realized what just happened. She was like, hey, my prophecy is about to begin unfolding. And so she comes down from Olympus, goes into the oceans, visits Ceto and Phorcys and Medusa and her sisters, and she explains the whole ordeal. Like, yes, this child was really their child. She had no involvement in creating Medusa per se. If anything, Medusa was Poseidon's child, like all the other oceanic children that belonged to him. But what Athena explained is that she was part of this grand plan that she thought at the inception of the universe. She knew it would come to be a symbol of commitment, of unbreakability, of clearness, and all these other things. And she really wanted this rock to be, in many ways, a symbol of her wisdom, like hard, strong, but clear and beautiful. And so after explaining all of that, of course, Ceto and Phorcys, as godly serpents would, not only are they reptiles, but they're also gods. They're like, okay, sure, you can take Medusa. They were actually very proud that Medusa was part of this grand scheme. So what happened is that Medusa, this 5-year-old looking godly child thing, went with Athena off into not Olympus, but a new island that Athena wanted to set for herself. She explained to Medusa that this island would be the place where they would create a temple to house and protect this diamond, because this diamond really came to be Athena's holy symbol. And as time went by, Medusa and Athena grew really close together. Medusa learned all of Athena's teachings, and she became her best priestess to ever exist. There was no faith like Medusa's faith for Athena. There is nothing that Athena would say that Medusa would contest. The word of Athena was the word of God, quite literally. But as time went by, Medusa's cult with Athena grew really strong, and eventually the word reached the ears of Poseidon, who he wasn't super stoked to hear about all of that. Athena, his nemesis, became all this powerful with the power of a child that in his eyes was his own. And eventually, he thought he should do something about that.
So one of the things that shows up with Algol pretty often that I think we can identify as having a relationship with Medusa's myth. It was, say, a particular relationship with institutional religion. You seem to see a lot of distrust or criticism of religious institutions. We'll often see themes around a sort of denigration of what would be considered holy or sacred. Medusa is this figure who began as, say, a holy person, someone who worshipped her god, played by her god's rules, and acted as a representative of her god, in this case Athena. Nonetheless, her story takes her about as far away from that as you can imagine. When Poseidon violates not only her, but the temple that she represents, she becomes tainted, polluted, made unholy, if you will, by what? By another god, by an authority figure, but by being absorbed into profane, carnal, crude body stuff, lust, desire, things held to be on a lower rung of experience, and to, participate in such activities makes you unsuitable to being a representative of the gods. However, in this myth, as well as many others, the gods themselves are not immune or clear of carnal desires, which I think ends up being a theme in a lot of Algol charts or lives touched by Algol. There is an awareness of what is considered to be holy or held above, held high in esteem, considered to be clean and pure. Those things can also be violated by the people who practice them. There's a lot of hypocrisy in religious institutions. And part of the Algol matrix of significations seems to be this disintegration, maybe, or dissolution of the idea of holy or sacred things, of purely spiritual things which are not polluted by earthly experience. Say equally that you'll see a sort of a raising up or elevating of crude, profane things. One of the things that Algol seems to do is erode the idea that these things are separate and seem to bring attention to the ways that the idea of sacred, institutionalized categorization of behavior and actions into pure or impure things is actually very harmful, or the ways in which it can be harmful. I see this show up in big and small ways, and not always directed exactly towards religion. It's probably not unfair to say that Algol can bring about a sort of crudeness.
I'm 11, I swear to you. I didn't even have a pube. I didn't know what my dad was talking about. Well, I had one pube, and I put it under the pillow for the pube fairy to come. And he came on my pillow, which was really bad.
If you're not happy, nobody's happy, okay? Happiness comes in small doses, folks. It's a cigarette or a chocolate chip cookie or a 5-second orgasm. That's it, okay? You come, you eat the cookie, you smoke the butt, you go to sleep, you get up in the morning and go to fucking work, okay?
The sort of reductionist approach to things that Algol seems to take and sometimes have an effect that sheds light on sort of ugly underbelly. That physical incarnation itself is messy, dangerous, brutal, and even our attempts to sanitize it are often just ways of redirecting the parts that we don't like at other things. And there's often a victim or scapegoat involved in that kind of activity, right? Even what we call civilization, the idea of being civilized, having a set of rules around which we conduct ourselves, make it possible for us to engage with each other in large groups without murdering each other, facilitates cooperation, facilitates a less messy experience. But even in that system, there are winners and losers. With civilization, we're trying to escape the anarchy, the nasty, brutish, and short existence of our less evolved selves, and rightfully so. There are powerful exploiting the weak. Those ugly bits of humanity just get channeled into other areas of life, like prisons, or impoverished neighborhoods, or sweatshops. Civilization, as it were, is not always so different than the anarchy which it is supposed to protect us from. In many ways, it's just a more elaborate jungle in which the strong exploit and oppress the weak. And, our sacred institutions, our concepts of morality, our laws can just as easily be wielded by the powerful to get what they want from the less powerful, to control their behavior.
Don't you know the world is built with blood and genocide and exploitation?
I'm completely anti-structural in terms of believing in institutions. I hate them. I hate any institutionalized social, religious, or economical thing.
Put Algol is actually a class of star system called an eclipsing binary, in which two stars, we'll call Algol A and Algol B, are bound together orbiting each other every 2.867 days. While Algol A is brighter and has more actual mass, Algol B has a larger radius. It's bigger, but dimmer. Our line of sight happens to align with the orbital plane of these two stars, causing eclipses during each orbit. Primary eclipse, where the larger and dimmer Algol B obfuscates Algol A, is visible to the naked eye, while the secondary eclipse, where Algol A slightly dims Algol B, is too faint for the naked eye to observe. So Algol seems constant, except during the primary eclipses, lasting about 8 hours, where it visibly dims, which is why Algol appears to wink. Now, just consider for a moment how insane it is that these two stars are completing an orbit with each other every 2.867 days. These massive celestial objects, these are stars, spinning around and around each other at a speed in which I'm pretty sure in celestial terms is fast as fuck. However, recent research has revealed that the gap between the current cycle length of 2.867 days and the 2.85 day cycle, originally documented by ancient Egyptians as a result of an ongoing mass transference from Algol B to Algol A. Algol B was originally a more massive star, but due to its size, advanced to a later subgiant stage of evolution much sooner. As in general, more massive stars go through their life cycle a lot faster than less massive stars. However, as Algol B expanded and their orbits grew closer together, Algol A began absorbing gases from Algol B, eventually growing brighter and more massive. In other words, Algol A is slowly devouring the former dominant star, Algol B. Every time Algol dims, we are witnessing, in a sense, the death throes of a dying star, briefly gaining the upper hand in a battle it cannot hope to win. Its former dominance long past, its fate sealed billions of years ago by the unforgiving laws of physics. When I contemplate the nature of these two stars, I can't help but feel a sense of futility, a sense that the universe, though beautiful, is also brutal and merciless, and our existence within it is only temporary and subject to forces much larger than ourselves. Interestingly, there's a third star in the Algol system, separated from the dueling pair, orbiting the other two roughly once every 2 Earth years, bearing witness, you could say, to the carnage as it unfolds. While Algol will sometimes show up in the charts of the perpetrators of heinous crimes, as well as the victims of atrocious acts, Algol seems to have at least as much to do with bearing witness to them, to making sure that they're not ignored, but what to do with knowledge of the things Algol seems to bring up when dealing with an Algol placement. How do we come to terms with the terrible things that people are capable of? How do we come to terms with the dark side of our own nature? Most of us would probably prefer to forget that underneath our frontal lobe and all of our higher cognitive reasoning and executive function, it's a brain that operates no differently than a shark or a Komodo dragon. It would seem that the story of Medusa suggests that even the gods aren't immune to behaviors driven by that part of the mind.
As I was saying, Medusa and Athena together went off into this island, built a temple, secured the diamond, which Medusa came from, and they founded this new cult of Athena. And this cult grew popular very, very quickly. Mind you, tourists and natives alike would all flock to the island. No one had seen a diamond before. That was the very first one. But not only that, a lot of women would also come to the temple to worship the egg as a symbol of not just their intellects clear and unbreakable, but also a symbol of Athena, the goddess herself. And like I told you, when Poseidon found out about that, he was not pleased. If you remember, technically Medusa is one of his children. She's from his lineage, so that really upset him. Not only Athena, his immortal enemy, was gaining all this power, but also she was doing that with his child. So Poseidon came up with a grand plan, at least he thought. Truthfully, he didn't even really understand why Medusa would be with Athena in the first place. As his child, she should understand how awesome the ocean is. All the fertility, all the bounty, all the pleasures, this was all his domain. Why would anyone give up on that to be with a goddess that promotes celibacy and no pleasure whatsoever. To him, that made no sense. And so he thought it was only a matter of really showing Medusa what she was missing out on, all of these exquisite experiences that he could provide her. And so his plan was, as Medusa matured, every night he would come to her in her dreams, sending visions of the most exquisite pleasures. All her senses would be activated. And he went on doing that for quite a while. But the more he did it, the more faithful Medusa would actually grow towards Athena. She saw all these visions as a test. She wasn't even quite aware that Athena wasn't involved. She thought Athena herself was sending all of these for her. And so she grew stronger and stronger in her faith each and every time. And eventually Poseidon started to get frustrated with each dream getting more intense than the next. And so the very last dream that Poseidon gave Medusa was one where her body became one with the ocean. And out of every orifice of her body, which was a little strange because she's both the ocean and still her body, children would pour out. The weirdest and the most beautiful creatures would all come from Medusa. And Poseidon thought, what an experience I'm giving this girl. If she doesn't come home, I don't understand what she's up to. And of course, Medusa thought that that vision was absolutely outrageous. She thought that that was the worst nightmare anyone could have sent her. And so from that day onward, she would not even sleep. She did not even want to get close to anything associated with those dreams. At that point, she didn't know it was Poseidon, but soon enough, she would find out. After sending that dream, Poseidon got really frustrated, and especially because she was not even sleeping, he couldn't even try to do anything anymore. So in his rage, he thought that he had to go there himself. He just needed to confront Medusa, and if he did that, especially with her standing before his godliness, he thought that it would be a no-brainer and she would just succumb to his power. So Poseidon goes down, talks to Medusa. He explains that all those dreams that she's experienced as she was growing up were all sent by him, not by Athena. Medusa was very weirded out by that, which made it even easier for her to resist Poseidon. So Poseidon in that moment tried to double down, showing her, explaining to her what his realm was really like and what the experiences that she could have if she returned and switched to his side. But Medusa was just not having it. Her faith in Athena was just too strong, and even standing before Poseidon, her will was too strong for it to be broken, or at least she thought, because since she was still technically of Poseidon's lineage, there's very little that a mortal like Medusa could do to actually resist against him. He was her very blood, and that's truly what he became in that time. He transformed himself into this weird tar-like thick liquid and inserted himself inside Medusa's veins, and he took absolute control over her body. There was very little that she could do to actually resist him at that point. Standing before him was one thing, but being inside her, in her body, was a whole entire different story. So Medusa could really do nothing. She couldn't scream, she couldn't run. All she could do was just watch as Poseidon, through her body, destroyed the entire temple, killed every single worshiper that was there, and destroyed the diamond that she was born from and that her and Athena secured in this island for all of these years. Poseidon in that moment shattered the diamond and spread it across the whole entire universe. He thought Athena won't be able to retrieve this ever again. And in trying to usurp her power, he inadvertently actually fulfilled Athena's prophecy. And after all of that was done, diamond gone, the temple destroyed, all of the worshippers' bodies piled up in the island, there was only one of Athena's treasures left to destroy. And of course that was Medusa herself. And so Poseidon, through Medusa's own body, terminates her. Though she could not speak and she couldn't move, she still prayed to Athena. And her prayer was so potent, it was so sincere, that it immediately reached Olympus. And all that Medusa asked of Athena was that she would avenge her death and the death of all these other worshippers that now laid in the island. Realizing what had happened, Poseidon scuttled away very quickly from within Medusa's veins just before Athena had actually returned, seeing what had happened. The pile of bodies, Medusa's own dead body, and now the diamond scattered across the universe. Athena saw this coming, but she never really knew exactly how this was actually going to manifest. she actually grew very fond of Medusa. To see Medusa in that state was heartbreaking. And so Medusa's request was really a no-brainer. She had to do something about it. She went to Medusa's body. She extracted its innards very carefully to the point that the body was just this empty sack of flesh with nothing inside but the skeletal mass and some of the muscles and the bones. But it was very, very deflated and gross looking. She took those innards and buried them at the center of the island. And just as she buried them, like not much time had passed, flowers began to bloom from that very spot. Hellebore flowers. As the flowers grew, Athena would cut one and 2 new flowers would bloom in its stead. And as she kept doing that, she would take all these blooms and fill up Medusa's body all over again until it was not this flimsy sack of flesh anymore. It started to look more like she was alive, but of course she was very still. Gross looking. She was a corpse. I'm not laughing because this is funny. I'm laughing because it's gross to be talking about it. But what Athena did after the body was full of these hellebore blooms, she took Medusa to the dilapidated temple. She beheaded Medusa and set her head aside, but the body she set into a pyre at the altar with wormwood. And this fire would burn for 3 days straight. Things got actually pretty out of hand. The smoke enveloped the whole entire island in this cocoon, and it was this purpley, sparkly, ashy gray smoke. The fire was gone, the smoke too, and so you could actually see the island again. Athena was there the whole time. She never left Medusa's side. And really, what's 3 days for a god? So after all that smoke went away, it revealed 2 eggs. One that was black, very similar to Medusa's sister's eggs, and the other one that was a diamond. This diamond egg Athena took with her. She thought she would take it to Olympus for protection, but with the black egg, she actually cracked it, and from it came out this thick goop, very similar to the goop that Poseidon had become to possess Medusa, and it splashed all over the place, and from a pool that kind of looked like a tar pool almost emerged this headless snake just wriggling around very grossly. It was quite a grotesque scene. But after the body was fully materialized, Athena went and grabbed Medusa's decapitated head and attached to it, and Medusa's eyes lit with new life. Partly Athena's power, but also a lot of Medusa's rage itself was animating this body. And so as this monstrous Medusa was now born, Athena gave Medusa's request to this monster that she would avenge her death and the death of all the followers. And the way that she would do it is the way that most of us are familiar with. She, by gaining part of Athena's power and also together with Medusa's rage, this new being that was born in the island had now the power to freeze anybody into a statue. After giving this mission to the monstrosity, Athena goes back into Olympus carrying the baby diamond egg that came out of that whole ritual. And so after Athena was gone and the monstrous Medusa was in the island by herself, she reaches towards the pile of bodies of all of the followers of the temple, and she eats all of their eyes, spitting back new life into them. So she literally used their rotting eyes as fuel to create these extensions of her in a way. Presumably because of Athena's power, after Medusa would breathe new life into them, they looked just like regular humans. Most of them were actually quite beautiful. The only thing that was slightly upsetting was that, of course, they didn't have eyes. With all the followers now back to life, the cult could now be reestablished. But now with a very different mission. A mission to kill and conquer Poseidon's children. So the island that was once a sacred haven for wisdom and philosophy and higher knowledge now became the grave for many of Poseidon's children. Because these zombified worshippers were still so beautiful, they would attract seafaring men, which were Poseidon's children, to the island. They would crash their ship and seduce them, take them to the remains of the temple, and do all sorts of dances and rituals that many of them looked very similar to the visions that Medusa received from Poseidon when she was a child. But as soon as Poseidon's children would reach the moment of climax, of course, because they're seducing them, but they're going at least like 90% of the way. But in that moment where they were supposed to feel this crazy, super heightened psychedelic level pleasure, Medusa would reveal herself and as soon as they looked at her, they would be turned into diamond sculptures. So eventually, this island became littered with these sculptures of mostly men, but also women and all these other types of people. And as time went by, word got around and people were starting to avoid that island altogether. Some people were even heard the rumors about a monster that lived there, and they tried to defeat her, but none of them really could. Medusa was really just too powerful. But as things were getting out of hand, at around that same time, back in Olympus, the diamond egg that Athena had brought with her actually cracked. And from that egg came out a new Medusa that was devoid of any sort of evil, or even her memories, all these painful memories that she had, they were all gone. But from Olympus, looking down into the island and seeing what this monstrous version of her had done, she asked Athena, we need to do something about that, because we can't just keep letting this cycle of vengeance continue on. Eventually there won't be even space for anything, and what's the point of that Medusa even staying there at that point? And Athena heard her. She really understood. After all, Athena was the goddess of wisdom. She can have her own fits of vengeance, but as the goddess of wisdom, she complied and took matters into her own hands.
So Medusa's role in the story is fundamentally that of the villain, a destructive, malevolent being that must be destroyed, regardless of what version of the myth you're dealing with. But it's in her origin story that you get a lot of variation between versions of the myth. Some depict her as more sympathetic than others, but pretty much all of them involve original human Medusa overtaken by lust, either involuntarily as a victim of Poseidon's lust or as a voluntary one. But because of the nature of the hierarchy involved, this fall into profane animal activity, we could say, necessitates that she be cast down. She's been made unholy, if you will, and she can't come back. She's now a total creature of primitive instinct, and she belongs to the base realm of instinct and passion, this sub-rational state that is not looked upon favorably by the gods / the powers that be. So she's now, in a sense, both agent and object of that which lies outside the favored power structure, which places her in opposition to it, either by sheer nature of what she has become now, or you might imagine, because she is justifiably pissed. It's fair to say that Medusa is not a beneficiary of the civilized order and is actively disempowered by it. And while this kind of broad framework or dynamic will pretty consistently show up around Algol stuff, it brings a sort of broad antisocial theme, not antisocial in doesn't want to talk to people, but opposed to society in some way, which can vary considerably. Still very often see people with Algol placements placed on one side or another of this dynamic of oppressor and oppressee. It signifies an oppressive order that is being challenged or undergoing a process of deconstruction. Sometimes that oppressive structure is rationality, or, maybe an individual sense of shared reality that constitutes much of what we like to call sanity, which has the potential of being undermined by non-rational things like fear or rage or lust. Algol is always aiming for the head, the top of the hierarchy, or, your rational mind. There's definitely some tendency towards madness or insanity with Algol placements, or things which defy rationality in many ways. But more specifically, the myth of Perseus and Medusa really outlines rather unambiguously a specifically patriarchal order in which the main victims are women. Both Athena and Medusa are wronged parties. Wronged by who? A male god, Poseidon, who represents that patriarchal system, which both Athena and Medusa are subject to, their actions and agency confined or constrained in some way by it. And so they must undermine it from within or below, right below the head. And one of these themes that you will totally see play out with Algol is this revenge of the aggrieved woman, or you could say feminized figures, by which I mean rendered passive. The passive, the receptive, which has been abused and mistreated, but you get this theme around the means of retaliation or revenge being this sort of inversion or redirection of the nature of the victimization. And many people nowadays describe Algol representing this raw feminine power, destructive feminine maybe. Far be it from me to
claim to be the authority on what that means exactly. But what I'll see a lot with Algol is this sort of redirecting what is received back on the offending body, the person, the system, the institution, whatever the individual is being forced to put up with, in a sense, to receive from a kind of passive space and turn it back on the other, right? Since using your opponent's weapons against them, Medusa's essentially been reduced initially to like a sexual object. It seems to me that socially, culturally, symbolically, we tend to place sexuality within originating from the feminine, right? Desire compels you to do all sorts of things to satisfy that sense of need, that sense of desire, right? And when we like desire, we like to own it. We speak about it like the desire originates within us rather than the object, but when we don't like it, and I mean the figurative we, speak about the desire like it's originating from the object, the offending object, which draws forth this passion that will make you do things that are not rational, right? Rationally, you know you shouldn't eat ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but if you really love ice cream, you might find yourself just doing it because the desire, right? The desire made me do it, as with the, within Christian mythology, with the Garden of Eden, right? The problem isn't with me, the problem is within the passive object of my desire, which failed to conceal itself from me and inflame my desire. And you see this reflection or projection goes both ways. There's a theory that I can't quite recall the name or origin of, but it essentially suggests that much or most of the human social paradigm of men trying to control or oppress women essentially revolves entirely around the issue of paternal confidence on a sort of instinctual level. Basically because men can never be certain that any children they have with a female partner are truly theirs, not potentially fathered by another male to, offset that fear and uncertainty. Historically, men have implemented an infinite variety of ways to rein in or control female sexuality by physically keeping the women isolated, separated from other people, or propagating beliefs and ideas that circumscribe specific forms of acceptable sexual behavior, which serve to mitigate the lack of paternal confidence. I think there's something to it. At the heart of it, you get this need for control, not just over like the biological process of reproduction, but the biological process of having emotions and wanting things. We'll call it patriarchal tradition, has essentially relegated all things associated with the physical plane, bodily matters, earthly matters, with the feminine principle. The physical plane responds to the forces imposed upon it. The body, the emotions, they respond to and receive input, while masculinity has been attributed with all things essentially spiritual or mental, fire and air, right? The active principle and the privilege to have impact and really, in essence, have agency. It's why so many cultures, religions, and philosophies focus on the baseness of physicality, the ability for the physical plane, the earthly plane, to corrupt the spirit, to reduce its agency, disempower it. And so much human activity is directed towards the conquest of all that's physical, of controlling our bodies, controlling the world, the physical world, subsuming it to the mind, the will, the masculine principle, as it were. So as we tend to do with all that profane earthly shit, in a patriarchal framework at least, keep it under our thumb, bend it to our will, exploit it, get it to do what we want, do what we can to remove or deny and objectify. But this idea of feminine power, at least as I understand it, is rooted in physicality, which has mass, which has gravity. Mass, which can obstruct and deny, so the power of receiving or not receiving, or supporting or withholding support. Elementally, it's the power of cooling things, of absorbing and taking in energy or heat and diffusing it. But it's real power, in a sense. It's the power to draw in, gravity, right? It's drawing in and holding or deflecting. And we can see this with Medusa. It's actually really pronounced. As a monster, she's not out creeping through the night, snatching up children, seeking out victims. She's a passive object. She's stationary in some underground layer on the edge of the world, and she turns people to stone just by being looked at. The real irony of Medusa is that in every way, she's only a villain because the male characters, the patriarchy, if you will, perpetuates that as her role. Her victims come to her because they want her. They want to conquer her, impose their will on her, and render her an extension of their own glory. But that's the beauty of it, is she's, in essence, only redirecting the objectification, the victimization, the removal of agency back on to the victimizers, right? The conquerors. And this is the kind of power that Al Ghul wields. And you'll see the theme a lot. Case in point, Osama bin Laden, Mars conjunct Al Ghul, he certainly identified with, and in many ways validly, the perspective of a disempowered person or people who suffered abuse and exploitation at the hands of a more powerful hierarchy, right? Osama bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia, a nation state that was the product of the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire during World War I by the Entente powers, by Great Britain, France, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was ratified when the sun was conjunct Al Ghul, but essentially sliced and diced the region, drawing political borders based entirely on Western interests, with literally no consideration for the ethnic, cultural, religious makeup of the region. Saudi Arabia was made up, in a sense, by the English and French. And, for the record, not condoning anything Osama bin Laden did, but you can imagine why people in the region might be upset about that, being exploited by outside powers, being separated, having their lives defined, having their agency as a people in many ways removed, mutilated in a sense. So you can imagine why people might form non-state organizations based on the religious, cultural, social, ethnic landscape of the region, which have a vested interest in resisting that exploitation, such as the Mujahideen that Osama bin Laden joined to resist the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan and imposition of a Soviet government on the region in the 80s. And at the time, the United States was more than happy to support their activities with lots and lots of weapons and money and resources, as long as it served their interests, which at the time were undermining the expansion of communism in the Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Mujahideen gladly accepted weapons from, their enemies, because why not? And, would eventually use those weapons against the United States. And I want to reiterate that I'm not condoning anything that Osama bin Laden did. He was an extremist who did monstrous things, but that extremism, that violence, that willingness to go to extreme lengths didn't, emerge on a whim. But his whole strategy for waging jihad against the United States and Western imperialism was to lure their armies in, lure Western nations into conflicts, into protracted forever wars, who would commit more atrocities and create more extremists, but essentially using their own interests against them, against the United States, against the West. It's diabolical and utterly monstrous, but also genius. It's extraordinarily effective in exactly how Al Ghul operates. And this is where Al Ghul can get pretty nasty. It retaliates, gets its revenge, right, by, sometimes becoming just as terrible as the initial persecutor or injustice, reflecting that injustice back on to their persecutor, but sometimes participating in that injustice. You see this theme, it doesn't have to always be terrible, too. It can be kind of badass. This whole theme around vision, just something that has become relevant in modern times, this discussion around this idea of the observer's power to define its subject, its way of deconstructing, understanding how white men, Ghul, or the patriarchy as a whole, essentially, impose power and authority on a psychological level through the idea of the gaze, right? For the record, Jean-Paul Sartre, the guy who first introduced the idea of the gaze, was born with Jupiter conjunct Al Ghul. From that, we get the idea of the male gaze, right? But then we have Medusa, quite literally turning the objectifying power of the gaze, of looking upon somebody, making them a object. However, when anyone casts their gaze upon Medusa, they become the object, a statue. And I mean, even before this idea of the gaze, right, eye contact has long been a dominance thing. Traditionally, low status people, peasants, right, aren't supposed to look at the king, aren't supposed to make eye contact, because eye contact makes you appear a threat. But Medusa turns the whole thing on its head. This is how the feminine principle undermines the hierarchical structure, by subverting the rules, deconstructing what are, in fact, almost entirely mental structures. Nation states, bosses, landlords, all that stuff is all stuff we made up. Al Ghul comes in to restore balance and, ideally create a sort of unity. Create unity between the physical, primal, realm of experience, and the mind, the spirit which animates the flesh. They were always supposed to be one. And Algol brings our attention to the consequences, trying to suppress the biological imperative. On a mundane level, you spend all your time working, trying to climb the corporate ladder, out in the world making shit happen all the time, but you're not sleeping. That'll bite you in the ass. But I think as a society, many people are becoming more aware of the need to, honor having feelings, being tuned in to the needs of the body and the heart, the feminine principle, and allowing that, on an internal, personal level to have more of an equal seat in how we live our lives, but hopefully long-term, at least, moving towards something that more closely resembles gender equality. But while the feminist interpretation of the myth of Perseus is super relevant, the traditional, perhaps more straightforward interpretation has its merits too, because there are certainly elements of our animal, primal, carnal nature need to be kept in check. And it's really at the core of the myth and what I really think Algol is all about, which is that, perpetual dance with that most primal, instinctual, emotional states, which is fear.
So here we are, the island now reestablished, so is the cult, with now evil Medusa just wreaking havoc, creating lots and lots of very interesting diamond sculptures, if you will. R-rated diamond sculptures throughout the whole entire island. The good Medusa sees this, and if you remember, Athena took this little diamond egg back to Olympus, which we can assume was like the good half of Medusa, like her good diamond, her good spirit is severed from this bad diamond, bad spirit. So once this good Medusa is born, she sees everything that's happened, and she requests Athena that she put a stop to it. Athena, goddess of wisdom, cannot say no, and so she says yes, and she does do something about it. What she does is that she removes her pinky finger, she severs it, and tosses it down into the earth. And this finger actually fell through the cracks of a cage, which was keeping this innocent woman captive. The woman hadn't eaten for days, and in a way you can sense that she was chosen for that reason, because very quickly she saw that finger fall, not knowing that it was Athena's finger, but she was just so hungry that she just went and ate it. As she swallowed it, her hunger immediately subsided. But as the finger reached her stomach, it actually made its way into her womb, where it very quickly turned into a child. And within hours, the child was born. The child will later be named Perseus, but in that moment, Danae, which was the name of the lady who was captive, just didn't really have much time to think about this. And it was very strange because not only did she not know that she was pregnant, she couldn't have been pregnant, and the baby came out already seemingly super intelligent, to the point that it actually opened the cage, it found a way to open the cage and free his mother and himself. And eventually they found safety, and once they did, Athena and the good Medusa descended to pay them a visit. Athena explained to Danae that that child was really not hers. It was really not a child. It was Athena's pinky finger. But to defeat Medusa, the pinky finger had to be a little bit more than just a finger, and so it had to go through this entire procedure. Danae was very taken aback by the whole thing, but it was a child that came out of her, so she still very much loved that child. And as Athena was explaining the whole situation, she was actually a little afraid that this child was made to defeat this monstrosity. She asked Athena, we're not expecting this baby to go there off right now. Like, I understand that he is technically you, but even still, it's just a baby. How can a baby fight against this demon? And Athena's like, no, you don't have to do this now. But he will grow very quickly, and when the time comes, when he feels ready, he can go into this island. There's really no rush, and especially for a god like Athena, she's like, oh, whatever. We've been at this for a couple months. A few more dead bodies, especially dead Poseidon children, is not a big deal. Like, you can take your time. But what she said, yes, there's no rush, but whenever you're ready, like, that will be the moment and you have to go. And when the time comes, there's something that you'll need. And in that moment, Athena touches Medusa's shoulder, and Medusa seems to understand what's going on, and within a couple seconds, her body transformed into this shield, into this glass shield. Danae is like, you're sending off this child to fight a monster. with a glass shield. That makes no sense. I can hang it in the wall, it looks really nice as a mirror, but as a shield, I'm not sure this is gonna go anywhere. But Athena assures her, it's fine. I know what I'm doing. I'm the goddess here. You're just the human. Just be thankful that you're never gonna be hungry again after eating my finger. And so Danae is just like, okay, I understand. You're the goddess here. And so time goes by, and Perseus grows into a rather valiant young man. Danae wasn't super aware of this, but actually Medusa, as the glass shield, could communicate with Perseus the whole time. And through these years of him growing up, I think before he goes into the island, he was probably around 18 years old. And this whole time, Medusa continued to do what she knew best, which was to teach and to be a priestess of Athena. And so Medusa, even though she was in the form of a shield, she telepathically, if you will, transferred much of Athena's teachings to Perseus. And of course, the biggest teaching that she imparted into him, which would be one that becomes very useful as he goes into the island, was that of celibacy, of restraint, and of putting the mind over the body. And so when the time came, like I said, at around his 18th birthday, he went into the island. At this point, the island had even more sculptures, not that many, because at that point, people were just not going there. They were just avoiding the island altogether. At that point, people were very aware that the monstrosity was dwelling there. It was actually a surprise when Perseus got there, and all of the temple priestesses with their veiled heads would approach Perseus, and time again, they would try to seduce him, and every time Perseus would resist, very much echoing some of the same things that Medusa did when Poseidon approached her. And after the many attempts of the priestesses of the temple, Medusa herself grew furious. She's like, why is this kid not falling for the plan? There's like, it's always worked. Why is it not working this time? And so she gets very, very upset, and she comes out of the shadows. But as the evil Medusa is coming towards Perseus, he hears her, and he immediately turns to her with his shield covering his face. He wasn't really aware of what he was doing, mind you. If anything, he really just got lucky to be there and do the right thing at the right time. So much so that he was alive. It was very much a whim of fate in that moment that he got that lucky, that just by virtue of turning back with his shield covering his face, he won the battle. The monstrous Medusa was now turned into a diamond sculpture herself. But in that moment, the voice from the shield reached Perseus, and the good Medusa just had this great pull towards the creature, almost like she knew it was her other half. She knew it was herself. It almost felt like she needed to be whole again in that moment. After this whole ordeal happened, the prophecy fulfilled, her legacy fulfilled. She didn't know how to live on if not whole. And so she asked Perseus to reunite them, but that was a little complicated for Perseus. For Medusa, probably fine, but for Perseus, on the other hand, he didn't really know what he was getting into, because Perseus goes and decapitates the Gorgon Medusa, which was very obvious that that head and that body are not one and the same. So he takes the head and attaches it to the glass shield, and immediately they merge into this new shield. Perseus really felt this big wave of power. Now that the evil Medusa, which was imbued with Athena's power, if you remember, was reunited with the good Medusa, that was just this godly being to begin with, and this being with all this Athenian wisdom, after they reunited, their power just magnified. Perseus could feel that he had the same powers that the monstrosity that he fought against had were now his, and all the wisdom that Medusa had while she was alive were now his. But with that too came all of Medusa's memories and all of her pain and all of her suffering, all the dreams that she was tormented with as she was a young maiden. And more strong than anything was her need for vengeance. That same prayer that she cast down into Olympus upon her death now echoed within the shield and echoed within Perseus' head. And he could have just dropped the shield. He could have just left it in the island. But why would he leave all this power behind? He felt so powerful that he felt like nothing really could stop him. And somehow, maybe because he is a portion of Athena still, he sensed that that shield would come useful one day and would save his life. And so he kept it. But in keeping it, Perseus had to fight against Medusa's voice, against Medusa's vengeance, against Medusa's rage and intellect. And yes, the shield did save him one day, but to this day, Medusa's voice still echoes in his head.
So let's not forget the stated hero of the myth, which is Perseus. As the hero, Perseus embodies the virtues, the equalities generally favored by Western Greek society, Hellenistic society, much of which we carry over as cultural descendants. And let's not forget that Perseus, and he's essentially on a quest to overcome both the dark base animal self, represented by Medusa, but also the corruption of the social order. And as a hero, he represents a more conventional approach to overcoming those forces. And the simplified version, the first leg of his quest, he's got to go monster slaying, going on adventures, building up towards the big boss battle with Medusa, who at a most essential level is the embodiment of fear. Everything about Medusa represents something to be feared. Medusa is both literally terrifying, she's a Gorgon, right? But the threat she represents, in the broadest sense, is the threat represented by fear itself. Fear has the power to incapacitate us, paralyze, right? Fear inhibits action. If you let fear get the better of you, the Greeks would call you a wussy little feminine boy, right? But the antidote, the sort of counter to fear, is courage. Courage being an act of will. It's doing the thing that you're afraid of, pushing yourself through, stepping up, being a badass. However, you need more than just courage to deal with Medusa. You need that other most favorite virtue of the Greeks, cunning. You gotta be smart about it. You can't just go blundering in. That's what the other heroes did, and they're all statues now. To really deal with Medusa and the fear she represents, you have to recognize its power, not suppress or ignore it, but acknowledge and respect it. So at the broadest level, Perseus is a more balanced hero. And actually, he's a bit more of a humble hero in a certain respect. Perseus's courage is tempered with, wisdom and cunning, though not necessarily his own. Perhaps maybe a more important takeaway, or a more important message that's being conveyed, is that part of what makes Perseus successful is that he has the support of the gods. It was Athena that hooked him up with the weapons and the shield, right? It's less about Perseus being so clever himself, but having the wisdom to do what the gods tell you to do and act in accordance with their will, because they want Medusa gone. Perseus is our agent of socially approved justice, and by operating within the system, within the hierarchy, he overcomes his fear. And while Perseus overcame and defeated Medusa and what she represents, it doesn't equate to the elimination of fear, of the primitive instinctual part of our nature. By decapitating Medusa, he has, essentially removed fear's power to have control, to have agency over him. An emphasis on him, because as her decapitated head still retains that power to petrify, which he can now wield against his enemies, used to further his will. The message here isn't necessarily about eliminating the more primitive, pre-civilized part of our nature. It's about wielding it. And essentially, it's saying that once you become master of, the primal part of your nature, it no longer has control over you, and you can now use it to control other people. And Perseus sort of models a conventionally virtuous approach to wielding that power. Medusa, as originally a priestess of Athena's temple, is essentially an extension of Athena. She's supposed to be a representative of Athena's will on Earth. So when Poseidon violates her temple, in our words, Medusa, this is symbolically our wording Athena. And the specifics of the story are subject to various interpretations, but the one I prefer to take away, the one that I find to be the most positively informative and useful when dealing with the issues that Algol brings up. Medusa is essentially a proxy for Athena, or what Athena represents. A female god who inhabits a very unique space. She plays with weapons. She does most of the things that the male gods do, and she maintains sovereignty within that pantheon by not giving herself away sexually to any of the other gods, right? And she's a strong woman in a man's world, in a sense. But she has to play by those rules, by the patriarchal rules. It doesn't make her immune to falling victim to it, if only in a more indirect way. But I like to think of Athena turning Medusa into a Gorgon as a way of protecting Medusa, but also empowering her to stick it to the man, right? Which is empowering on a certain level, but Medusa serves as a metaphor for the trauma response. One that protects that wounded part of oneself, the part that's disempowered, right? And satisfies potentially a certain need for retribution, to create consequences for the perpetrators of the offense. It's not an easy life for Medusa. She's isolated, renegade. After a certain point, Athena decides it's time to bring her home, or perhaps wield Medusa's power deliberately. There's a sort of, I think, a positive message about respecting that raw, primitive power that resides within all of us and integrating it as a complementary component of our conscious will, but doing it responsibly. Perseus, to me, in many ways, is honoring what I think most of us can agree are the useful things to have, which are our laws, rules. Civilization is pretty useful, but perhaps, representing masculine virtues, right? I think in a lot of ways, the fear that Medusa represents has a general application, but might be a little more specifically a particularly traditionally male fear. Right? What are men most afraid of in general? Traditionally, being feminized in a sense, being rendered passive, being made an object. But I think there's a fear and a sort of covetousness, perhaps. It runs in some of the more toxic manifestations of masculinity, the sort of misogynistic resentment towards women, which I think is rooted in genuine fear of the immense power that women do in fact wield over them. Often it's more visibly, that sort of comes out as sexual power, the power that from a heteronormative standpoint women have to create desire, create attraction, right? To be beautiful, to be desirable, and withhold herself from them, from the man that desires her. And it's not just sexual, it's biologically generative, right? Women are the gatekeepers of life itself, but that essential power to deny anyone but archetypally men from participation in that process because they're being shitbags. A lot of men resent that, try to dominate women and take by force what isn't given to them freely. But by giving Medusa's head back, I kind of see that as an acknowledgement of that power and a respect for it. And at least as a gesture, looks like something akin to mutual respect, an acknowledgement of the powers inherent to that feminine, masculine paradigm. I think it says a lot about how to work with the feminine and masculine elements that exist within all of us, as well as how they play out on a broader social level. As we move forward this month and this pile-up of planets on Algol starts bringing some of these themes up within the world and potentially within our personal lives, we can do what we can to take the lessons which we can pull out of the myth. Try to operate as fairly as you can within this fundamentally hierarchical construct which we call civilization. Recognize that we are not all equal in our access to power, in our ability to act autonomously for both internal reasons and social, cultural reasons. You're going to get some people who do some crazy shit because that precarious equilibrium between mind and body, which we call sanity, fell radically out of balance in one direction or another. When, worked with, Algol can do some pretty cool stuff, as we've seen. But it is here universally considered the most malefic fixed star in the sky for a reason. Essentially, Algol awakens, stirs the monsters which our frontal lobes are built on top of. We are essentially beasts, right? We're animals capable of terrible things, each and every one of us. So if you notice the proverbial beast within, starting to surface, perhaps even stirring up parts of you that you find disturbing, that you would not want to identify with, right? Not consciously. Rather than be afraid, try to suppress or deny that part of yourself, listen to it, acknowledge it, and maybe give it an outlet. Ideally a constructive one. If you find yourself experiencing a powerful impulse to, murder your neighbor and take his car because you like it and it's better than yours, and he always mows his lawn at 5 o'clock in the morning, don't do that. But maybe give him a stern talking to. Tell him to stop mowing his lawn at 5 in the morning. Better yet, just go out on your porch and stare at him while he mows his lawn.
Are free, the only one, not like just anyone, precious like diamond. Oh, frail flesh and bone, the fear being born, not undying, just surviving, but revival before. Warning, fear, warning, warning. She threw it in the hands of Legatina. Warning, fear, warning, warning. She threw it in the hands of Legatina. Of three, the only one, of faith like Adam. She threw it on the hands of frail flesh and bone, the power to be won from Poseidon, by Athena warning, fear, warning, warning. And he took her from the warning, fear, warning, warning. And he tore her and your breath. Lady, come make it painful, give life to her day on. Come make it cripple, rust on the wall, skin on. Come make it painful, hell will be calling. I'm warm, one under man, the wife of the lady, come make it painful, give life to her day on. Come make it cripple, rust on the wall, skin on. Come make it painful, hell will be calling. I'm warm, one under man, the wife of the Of three, the only one. Now I'm dying, now I'm dying. Of three, the only one.
Tighten up your hair, cause the lich is coming. Rising up a hole where a fit is honey. Saw he wasn't a